stronger coalitions and get more scale, they typically become better natural states. That is, they produce economic development, right, and political development. They become more sophisticated. So the notion of drawing boundaries across which societies interact is really very appropriate for open access world that we live in, and probably not that appropriate for the limited access world. So the question is, how big is the natural state going to be? That's a somewhat flexible question to answer.
Okay, this is about the, you mentioned the Washington Consensus.
I'm Bruce Britton from the University of Georgia. You mentioned the Washington Consensus, which I gather you were didn't think was particularly successful. I wanted to ask you about that, and also the Copenhagen Consensus, in which Professor North was a major participant. The question really has to do with the Copenhagen Consensus seems to be about trying to get societies up to a level where they have enough to eat and aren't sick all the time. And it seems to me that would be a precondition for any of these, any progress to the doorstep, would be a condition. And I noticed that the things that you rated in the Copenhagen Consensus, which was a rating of various solutions to various world problems, were mostly in that area: access to clean water, malnutrition, disease, and so on. So the question has to do with getting to this doorstep. Isn't the sort of Maslowian, you got to survive first, you got to have safety, and then maybe you could progress.
Well, that's a good question, and what I want to emphasize is that the natural state is not, first of all, is all kinds of variation. In fact, every natural state is different. And one of the things that you've got to do if you're going to go and advise countries around the world, as I do, is you've got to take a lot of time to learn the beliefs and institutions of that particular structure. Even though they'll have the common characteristics of natural states that John has elaborated, you've got to understand the specifics in great detail. And I think that's what we tried to do there. Copenhagen Consensus, to move to the second point, Copenhagen Consensus was an attempt by a group of economists to try to see if we could improve advice to third world countries, mostly third world countries. And I think we were fairly successful, but I think that we still have a long ways to go, and a lot of the Copenhagen Consensus was developed and discussed without the usefulness, the framework that we've developed here, which we think is a big improvement over that.
Frank Mannheim, School of Public Policy. I'd like to bring in James Madison, who made a very careful study of often chilling history of democracies in history in the course of developing the Constitution, and concluded that the only way to sustain a democracy would be through an educated citizenry. Now, we have a pretty good emphasis on history, which you all have emphasized the importance of, but that faded out in the 60s. Could you discuss the role of education in your systems?
I agree with that. Education is a very important social function. And so we would expect in many natural states that access to education is limited or differentiated. One of the stories we have in the book is about the Aztec Empire. Compare the Aztecs and the Carolingians. Show why they're both basic natural states, that is, states that are able to support organizations within the framework of the state. And there were schools throughout the Aztec society, but there was a special kind of school whose name escapes me at the moment, which taught you both military skills, but the social and cultural skills that identified you as an elite. Now, I just finished reading Claudia Golden and Larry Katz's book, The Race Between Education and Technology, and one of the things the Europeans learned from the Americans at the end of the 19th century was educating everybody works! And they had an education system that was derived from a natural state. Right? And James Madison was writing about how do you get a good natural state, right? How do we build these interests? I think one of the things that open access brings with it, as Barry said, is a commitment to equality and open access to lots of privileges that become transformed from privileges into rights because they're available to everyone. And so part of this framework is to understand why most societies have difficulty supporting that kind of open access.
Arnold Kling, since we have an economic historian, I have to ask my favorite economic history question. Was there peaceful trade, 2,000 years ago, or was trade always something that took place under an empire and was basically, to allocate resources by emperors?
Which economics are you find?
So you can pick your
There was always trade. Okay, we know that we find stuff that was rocks from India that show up in glaciers in Sweden and places like that. So things moved around. And you didn't necessarily require an empire to create trade. But trade was always intimately related to the problem of violence, right? How do you protect piracy? Yeah. How do you protect the very valuable goods which are most likely to be high value, low weight? Those are the things that are going to be traded. So that there was always social institutions that developed to promote trade. One of the things that, in answer to the question about development, that there really are two development problems. The Washington Consensus is about the second problem, which is how you get to open access. The first problem is how do you get a good natural state that is, elites have an incentive to promote trade. They have an incentive to make their society larger and promote specialization and division of labor. Empires are relatively good at expanding the area in which trade is protected, and that produces good outcomes. The problem then, in the equilibrium sense, which Doug doesn't like and Barry doesn't, is that expanding access limits rents, right? And then that dissolves some of the links that are holding the system together. So where open access societies have a strong interest in promoting trade and providing the infrastructure to do that, natural states are always conflicted. They want to do it. They'd like to have some elites who benefit from it. At the same time, opening up too much can be disruptive.
I'm Wade Channel from USAID, and as part of the development community that you're describing here, I take great interest in this, and I just want to bounce an idea off of you from that. I'm here with my colleague Nick Cleases. We've done a lot of work on rule of law issues, and one of the things we're shifting towards is promoting a paradigm shift where much legal reform in developing countries is essentially a mechanistic approach, or really the impersonal approach. Let's take a law, put it here, and then people will react properly. We know what the healthy economies have certain laws. If we can get those laws into those economies, perhaps we'll have that. What you're describing is the law as is much more what we're promoting now, the idea that you can't change a law, you have a system in place, and that system must be fully negotiated. So the process of law is probably more important than the law itself, because it sounds like to me you're saying in the legal reform context is the traditional approach, meaning the last 40, 50 years perhaps, is a break with that. It's an attempt to impose the impersonal on personal while ignoring the personal. And my question essentially is, how does this fit within your thinking on change, and maybe are we moving towards a better approach with this?
Well, first, I think you want to say something too. I think you're exactly right in saying that part of the problem with existing approaches to the rule of law is that it takes the impersonal law of a developed open access order and wants to transplant it in, say, financial markets or corporations, labor law, that sort of thing. And so that's one of the main features. Another problem, of course, is the lack of perpetuity in those societies, as I emphasized. But there's a third piece that I didn't discuss, and that has to do with how courts work. Courts in so many developing societies don't look like court, don't work, they look like, they don't work like courts in open access societies, and the reason is because of what we commonly call corruption. And the way to think about corruption in this context is that individuality, that is personality, matters. Who you are matters. Who you're connected to matters, the kind of justice you get, and whether or not how much money you have, and whether you're able to bribe or not. And so courts that operate in that are rent-creating mechanisms that are part of, rather than judicial, impartial, perpetual impersonal systems, have a great deal of difficulty than looking at all like courts, let alone implementing these kind of laws that we want to transplant in that sense.
You know, I advise countries around, or I should say, I play God around the world. You know, I run around advising, and playing God is what you're doing. And one of the things that I'm always being asked is to create the rule of law in society. And so, you know, when I started, and I say, oh, well, all you're going to do is get a bunch of rules and put them in place, and that's all there is to it. Well, you know, I've learned very quickly that is a lot of apple butter, to use my favorite expression. It's a very complex structure because you've got to create not only a set of economic or legal institutions, but they've got to be backed up by political institutions that will support the level playing field characteristics of law. And then you've got to train judges to be impartial and to have those characteristics which in third world countries, as Barry pointed out, typically they don't have at all. So it's a very complicated process to put this in place. And usually when I go to third world countries and I'm stuck with this problem, why I either say, give me 15 years and I'll work it out, but you can't do it in a hurry.
I'm Bruce Johnson. I'm here on the faculty of law at George Mason. My question goes to the predictive power of your, what at this point I see as a story, and I'm just wondering if it has positive counterparts in terms of prediction. And so, can you predict like successes such as Chile, post-war Japan, and failures such as Argentina? Maybe, or at least say something, you know, systematic about those, or the success of common law over civil law, things like that. So I'm just curious to flesh out your theory here. Anyway.
Oh, okay. That means it's a hard question.
It's a hard
I think one of the things that we've tried to do is to understand the process. This is a conceptual framework. To understand the process, both the logic of how natural states work, the logic of open access, and then this process of the transition. So to the extent there's predictions of this, it's that as societies make a transition from limited access to open access, certain things have to change. That Barry's talked about from personal to impersonal. The development of perpetually live organizations that have a identity separate from the individuals that occupy them. So the office of the president and the office of the provost become things that are actually durable and perpetually lived, as opposed to people that are part of them. In the book, we talk about Britain, France, and the United States, but I think if we talked about all the developing countries, it isn't like there's a lockstep here of how you go. That they move through to some form of institution that enables that kind of open access to organizational forms to work. Now that generates different political institutions and economic institutions in every place. And the key, however, is that you get entry, that you get competition. You get what we call the double balance, which is the political competition and economic competition sustain one another. And we would say, as a prediction, that no society that's going to become developed and sustain high income will be able to do that. That a place like Argentina has trouble sustaining, it doesn't have trouble implementing an open access institution, right? But it really has trouble sustaining them. So the places that are attempting to implement institutional changes that can't quite get to open access on both dimensions typically are highly volatile. They fall back. So that Germany in 1900 is pretty much as rich as any place in the world at the time, or within the ballpark, but it has trouble sustaining open access after World War I. Now, is that predictive? Can I predict, will this country make the transition in the next 100 years? No. But it does say that the process of modern economic development and political, so here it is, modern economic development and modern political development are two sides of the same coin, and that don't both happen together, you won't get it happening. So to that extent, it's